This week marks the expiration of the New START Treaty, or New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. The bilateral agreement was signed in 2010 and entered into force on February 5, 2011, for a period of 10 years. In 2021, the Biden administration exercised the treaty's option to extend it for an additional 5 years, which brings us to today.
That sends a signal around the world that the United States and Russia are prepared to once again take leadership in moving in the direction of reducing reliance on nuclear weapons and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons as well as nuclear materials.
When New START was signed in 2010, there was optimism that both the United States and Russia would lead in nuclear force reductions and stem the proliferation of nuclear materials. Many hoped that the removal of tactical nuclear forces from Europe would soon follow. But a lot has changed since that agreement was signed 15 years ago, including Russia's 2014 and 2022 invasion and occupation of Ukraine, as well as its violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces INF Treaty. The past 15 years has also seen the buildup of both Russia and China's nuclear arsenals. In the United States, the last 15 years has been a time of renewed discussion, debate, and understanding of the need for U.S. nuclear modernization. So what does the expiration of New START mean for the future of the United States and Russian nuclear arsenals and broader U.S. and global security? What comes next for arms control in a post-New START world? And how can strategic risks be reduced in an increasing multipolar nuclear environment? I'm Kari Bingen, Director of the Aerospace Security Project. I'm joined by Heather Williams, Director of the CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues, and Tom Karako, Director of the CSIS Missile Defense Project, to answer these questions. Welcome back to the HTK series devoted to talking about strategic forces issues of the day. HTK stands for Heather, Tom, and Kari, but for the defense wonks out there, it also stands for Hit to Kill. We will take audience questions, so please submit those online via the event page. Heather, let's start with you. You're in the hot seat today. We're February 3rd today. February 5th is when the New START Treaty expires. So where are we today, and what are some of the trends that you're seeing?
Right. So where we are today is that there is an offer on the table to continue to observe the New START limits. Vladimir Putin has been putting this offer out there for a while. And so it is possible that this treaty will get a last-minute reprieve. President Trump could say, yes, I agree to Putin's offer and will continue to observe the central limits. Just to clarify, that does not come with all the intrusive verification, on-site inspections, and data exchanges that went with New START that made it so valuable for the U.S. But just to really situate us in this, literally this exact day and tomorrow, we are down to the wire here if the president is going to save this treaty. I'm leaning more towards it's probably just going to kind of go the way of other arms control treaties and be a product of its time and move on. The treaty itself, just very quickly, it was concluded in 2010, and it limited both the U.S. and Russia to 1550 nuclear warheads on 700 delivery vehicles and 800 launchers. The verification of it, I think, is really important because it came with intrusive on-site inspections and those data exchanges that I talked about. And so that was kind of the legacy of the agreement. 2010, the world's changed a lot since 2010. And so that brings us to some of these charts that I want to show about what has happened in terms of nuclear competition since 2010. This figure shows the types of active systems that Russia, China, and the United States have and what they've developed since 2012. And what you can see here is that under New START, U.S. systems have gone down by 17%. Whereas Russia has gone up by 22% and China has gone up by 29%. This does include some of the systems that are covered under New START, like ICBMs, SLBMs, and also the Chinese number and a lot of other systems has just gone up astronomically. There was one figure, Chinese intermediate range ballistic missiles have gone up by 635%. And that wouldn't fit on a snazzy chart like this, so I didn't include it. But another chart that can help tell this story. So these are non-strategic nuclear weapons types. These are not included under New START, but it shows the direction of travel for Russia, China, and the U.S. Again, we can see Russia has gone up by 25% in the types of active systems. This includes things like the Oreshnik that it has used in Ukraine on at least 2 occasions. These are dual capable theater range, clearly intended for their regional ambitions. China has gone up by 50%. The US has gone down by over 25%, as we can see here. And so the story behind these charts that I hope the message that they get across is that under New START, the United States has really shown incredible restraint. It has abided by a nuclear modernization plan that came with New START, and I know we'll talk about that a bit, but that modernization plan in a lot of ways was replacing aging systems. It was not some significant advancement in nuclear technology or nuclear capabilities. The restraint is just the best word I can really think of to describe this. And then this chart shows what Russia and China did while the US was trying to promote that transparency, predictability, the restraining power, reducing reliance on arms control. That was not reciprocated under this treaty. So that is the story of where we are now under New START. Just a couple other things about New START to flag as we dive into it more. It is kind of, I think of New START as like part of this trajectory of a legacy of arms control. You know, it started with SALT I in the 70s, we had the INF Treaty in 1987, then we have START I. You can just kind of see it as this progression. Under those agreements, the US arsenal has gone down by 88%. This is massive. Worldwide arsenals have gone down by 90% under these agreements. And so New START has this long lineage of bilateral strategic arms control, often involving verification. Not all of those did, but that's been something that's really important to us. Under New START, US and Russia did 328 data or on-site inspections and data exchanges. And so it's not to say that New START was a bad treaty at all. I don't think it was. I think it was it was definitely in the US interest at the time. It got us that predictability into the Russian arsenal. But here we are now with these expansions of the arsenals. It's also important to point out Russia's offer. I don't think that this is a good faith offer to continue to observe the treaty limits. The reasons for this.
We're supposed to take his word for it.
Exactly. Like Putin's not great at keeping his word, particularly in arms control agreements. Russia has violated at least 9 arms control agreements since Putin came to power. The Russians suspended inspections. So those really valuable on-site inspections that were one of the best parts of the treaty, you know, the Russians suspended those in 2022. Russia suspended participation in the whole New START treaty in 2023, and yet we're supposed to expect that you will continue to honestly abide by this. And so it defies logic a little.
As we heard from Rose Gottemüller testifying, I think this morning, that suspension was a violation.
Yes.
That's looked past, but that was a violation.
Yes, and so that's, again, I just don't see this, Putin's offer, this isn't coming from a place of good faith. It's also just worth noting that also in 2023, when Russia suspended New START, they also withdrew ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And if you look at the trends with Russia, they enter arms control agreements, they violate them, they keep building up, even if it's in areas not covered by those agreements. But the Russian direction of travel is pretty clear to me. And so, you know, ideally, it would be great to have some sort of agreement that limits them. But I think Vladimir Putin has shown us who he is.
Well, and can you spend a moment for us, especially for those maybe joining HTK for the first time, walk us through the fundamentals. What is the New START Treaty? What does it cover and what does it not? And then what are those enforcement mechanisms that you talked about?
Yeah, I went through it fast at the beginning, so this is a good moment to kind of zoom out. So New START, it was in 2010. There was a real rush around New START, and I'm excited to hear what it felt like for you both being on the Hill at this time, because the START I treaty was expiring in 2009. And there was this potential gap in verification for the US and Russia. And they had been engaging in these on-site inspections for decades by this point under a host of treaties. But New START limited both sides 1,550 operational strategically deployed warheads on 700 strategic delivery vehicles, so ICBMs, SLBMs, and bombers. Something that Rose Gottemüller, who, as you said, testified today, has always stressed that I thought was an interesting kind of trend or piece of New START is New START was really flexible in how it was built. It allowed both sides to mix and match. It didn't say you have to have X number of this delivery vehicle and Y number of that. that, you could mix underneath this umbrella number, which is a model that I think we might get back to, whenever the day for arms control comes again. The other piece of flexibility was what's called the bomber counting rule. Each bomber counts as one, but you might have multiple warheads on it. And so it acknowledged the changing strategic landscape and was designed to have that flexibility in it. But the real crux of New START, it was the verification component to it. So 18 on-site inspections a year, what did I say, 328 in total since the treaty started. That's a lot. There's also this kind of a softer side of the benefits of arms control, is it does provide some transparency into the Russian thinking. And it does build some of those kind of more tacit relationships and knowledge exchanges by having on-site inspections. Just a quick kind of anecdote, because I did my PhD on the history of arms control and trust building and inspections. And one of the stories that I'd heard was from American inspectors who went into the Soviet Union in the early 90s as some of the first START inspectors. And they said that when they met their Soviet counterparts, they realized just how dire things were in the Soviet Union. Like, these people hadn't seen fresh fruit in 6 months, was something that stuck with them. And so it's a part of arms control. It's not just about the numbers. It's also about the people and the relationships that go into it. And when you're doing 328 on-site inspections, that's a lot of time together as well.
And just to be clear, I think you said this at the outset, though, is Russia backed away from allowing on-site inspections back in 2022. So our ability to even verify has not been in existence for the last 3 years.
Not with on-site inspections. Both sides rely on national technical means to try to gain some insights. But yeah, those on-site inspections and a lot of the data exchanges, they just haven't been happening on the cadence of what we've been used to with the Russians for so long. And just a final point on there, we have nothing with the Chinese. There's no data exchanges similar to this. There are no and never have been on-site inspections. And when you see these numbers of how the arsenals are changing, it's just, the world just looks so different now than it did in 2010.
Well, and so 2010, Tom, the reason I wanted to show that Obama-Medvedev video at the outset is it seems so anachronistic. I mean, it was like we're transported back into another time and another place. Take us back there, because there were, I think the context at the time, the conditions at the time may have been more ripe for that agreement. That today, I mean, the world looks very different. So what do you recollect?
It was a very long time ago, and I went and looked it up. And one of you said, I think that was the year when there was the first iPad came out, and topping the charts was Lady Gaga's Bad Romance, which sounds like a metaphor for the Russian reset. It's been a long time, and it had only been a couple years since Russia had invaded one of its neighbors, 2008. People always invading Georgia. And people always kind of put that one past. And it really took the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014 to wake us up. But I think in that period, there was a heady, optimistic time. We're talking about disarmament. I mean, the four horsemen were riding herd and going for disarmament. That's just alien to where we are today. But another couple of things is, and I kind of, to some extent, go back to the late Bush administration. It was tail end of the Bush administration, when there was this DOE report that came out. It was kind of like, our nuclear modernization or nuclear systems or infrastructure is woefully out of date. And then it came the Strategic Posture Commission report in 2009, which to some extent really kind of on a bipartisan basis helped everybody realize that we've really neglected this. And so although there was this hope, sort of perhaps over-optimism for disarmament and relations with Russia and these kind of things, there was also this sinking awareness that we needed to do something. And that's really what really helped get the New START treaty through, was not just its merits, but a grand bargain that especially Senator John Kyle, who's just recently stepped back from public life, that he and others managed to extract in order to get ratification. That this was the 1251 report and the commitment of $100 billion and so on for nuclear modernization. Without that, frankly, I don't think we would be anywhere near where we are today, and things would be quite a bit worse. And Heather, you made an observation about this pattern for Russia getting into an arms control agreement, abiding by it for a little bit, quickly violating it whenever it's convenient for them. But the other piece of that pattern is that they do so knowing that we, our allies, are likely going to abide by it scrupulously. I mean, it's, sometimes the word lawfare is used here, that they're using our respect for treaties, or using our respect for the rule of law, you might say, against us. And the thing is, we keep falling for it over and over again. And it's not that we're not correct in doing and honoring treaties, but that's what we do. It's that we're going in with an overestimate that they will honor. And this is why, I think it was shortly after New START when there began to be the reports of the INF violations. And I've probably said this before, but it was John Kerry who said, look, if they're violating INF, and Rose Gottemuller said this morning that it was egregious violations of INF, that no nuclear arms control treaty, John Kerry said, will ever pass the Senate again. And I think it's a question whether there will ever be such a treaty passed the Senate on nuclear issues, because we don't trust them. Why would you set yourself up for that lawfare, set yourself up for that disappointment and bamboozling if you don't trust them to some extent? So, and again, pulling out the suspension of inspections is along those lines.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that the Russians make certain assumptions that we will be fair players. But to play devil's advocate, if a Russian were sitting here, they would say, well, you withdrew from the ABM treaty in 2002. And
pursuant to its terms.
But so many of the Russian, the Russian narrative that I hear, particularly around INF, but even on New START, even sometimes on CTBT, is it all comes back to the 2002 ABM withdrawal. And they'll say, oh, well, we were abiding by all these things, and then this suggested to us that you were no longer a trustworthy partner.
Well, wait a minute.
Again, I'm not saying I agree.
Yeah.
I'm saying if a Russian expert were sitting here, that's probably what they would say.
Well, so at which point I would point to Vladimir Putin's statement at the expiration of the ABM treaty, saying this is not a threat to strategic stability. 40 GBIs is not exactly a big deal relative to the Russian force. The statement from Putin in December of 2001, and then we gave the required 6-month notice, so the ABM treaty technically ended in June of 2002. But that's what Putin said at the time. But I would actually, to play devil's advocate to my previous comment there, is I would point to Putin's speech at the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where he said, this was back in the Bush administration, Putin said, hey, Russia's surrounded by countries, China especially, that are building up lots of these intermediate range missiles. Maybe we ought to get rid of the INF treaty. And so I actually think that they were, perhaps prudently, encouraging us, the United States, to get out of INF. And at the time, it seemed like we had such a relative advantage to staying in it that we did. But I think in retrospect, that might have been a mistake. Perhaps we'd be better off if we mutually had gotten out of INF
Well,
way
and
back
let's just
when.
point to the facts on the ground. Russia has long had its own homeland missile defense system, particularly a system that defends Moscow. They have over years developed their own missile defenses that, I guess, when we say regional missile defenses, we talk about things like Patriot and THAAD, and then we forward deploy them. When they talk about regional missile defenses, it's S-300, it's S-400, but it's defending their homeland. So let's kind of call a spade here. And then back to INF. I mean, we ended up publicly revealing information at the time, particularly in the first Trump administration, that Russia was violating INF in developing these medium-range missiles that could range much of Europe.
Just to make a quick observation about this conversation, which is part of the reason I love these conversations, is I think this is not the normal conversation about New START expiration. The normal conversation is, it's going to be an arms race. Russia and China are going to respond to whatever we do. They're going to break out. And I do think we should talk about that at some point. But first, just to reflect on what Russia and China have been doing, just have not gotten the attention that I think it deserves. And I credit multiple previous administrations for declassifying a lot of that information, particularly on INF. But even the DoD or Department of War China military power reports that they continue to put out. Like, these are a really important part of the story, but they don't seem to be getting the traction that I think they deserve. And I don't want to hold the entire international community accountable for the problems of arms control, but to some extent, Russia and China do have to be held accountable. They have gotten a free pass for these types of buildups. China increasing IRBMs by 635%. I haven't heard anyone in the UN or in all of these nuclear conferences that I go to, I'm not hearing people hold them accountable. Everything falls on the US.
You know, I think this is a really important trend. It is types of non-strategic nuclear weapons that you're counting here. And you're right, the average conversation on this is, oh my goodness, the sky will fall. You know, by the way, there was a 1-year gap between the previous and New START, and the sky didn't fall. So I'm not just super worried about waking up on February 5 and needing to head for a bunker. But what they're doing in this chart is they're racing on an entirely different racetrack from us. And so we're in a way thinking about the wrong things. We're like, oh, strategic nuclear weapons, and strategic is what the treaty says is strategic, by the way, as opposed to what is not included in the treaty. And so they're doing these things that are already outside of the treaty. So therefore, back to the it doesn't matter comment, you know, we could extend it legally. You can't do that, but hypothetically, it could be extended for 5 more years or 50 more years, and there'd still be this kind of a race, this still dynamic going on that is not covered by the strategic nuclear weapons counting. So I think what it comes down to is, are we counting the wrong things? Are we not counting the things that matter? And then there's the other piece, which you partly pointed to, is it's the quote-unquote arms race for non-nuclear strategic strike systems of intermediate range missiles of various kinds, for instance.
Well, that leads to then the question you both just teed up here. So what happens come February 5th when we have no binding agreement to curb nuclear arms? Do you think it's going to lead to an arms race and a massive buildup? You know, let's look at the data too, Heather. Does the data suggest, is there any signaling or comments that the Russians have made? Do we believe that there will be a buildup on their side?
It's funny you should ask that question, Kari, because I recently wrote a commentary that answers those exact questions. And I say that there's 3 truths about the end of New START. Those 3 truths are, no, this is not the start of an arms race, but if it were, America is losing, as those previous charts showed. We showed restraint, we reduced, while our adversaries used that as an opportunity. And I think mistook a restraint for weakness, perhaps, and they surged ahead. The second truth is that the United States does not need to do a massive buildup. In the article, I outlined 4 options for how the U.S. might respond on February 5th. First of those would be to upload warheads. And some former Department of Defense officials have come out and said the U.S. could probably upload to double New START numbers at some point. The timing was a little bit more fuzzy, whereas Russia has less upload capacity. So the U.S., I believe, can upload to around 3,700. Russia would be 2,800.
And you're talking more warheads on ICBMs especially.
Yes, on ICBMs especially. You can also do SLBMs, and you would have to change the tubes in the submarines, but there is an upload potential there. So that's one option. Another option is to develop some new theater range capabilities, because that's where you can see that real surge by Russia and China. But also, I think that is a potential future gap in the U.S. nuclear arsenal. That's where we have seen China and Russia show the most interest. And so it could be develop of some standoff or regional capabilities. Third option, take the current modernization program and just buy more of what we already plan to do. I would lean in on B-21s, for example. You can also buy more Columbia class. I have some concerns about shipyard capacity, but for the timelines that we're talking about anyways, you know, that is on the cards. The fourth option would be to not make this a nuclear competition and to instead focus on conventional capabilities and trying to ramp up conventional deterrence. I have serious concerns about that because of the allies. That for the allies, they could perceive this as a further weakening of U.S. credibility for their defense. And we're already picking up some signs from allies that they seem nuclear curious, shall we say, interested in maybe developing some nuclear latency. And so I think just setting this aside and saying, oh, that was a nuclear era, we have conventional problems to solve it, that's not the right answer either. And then the third truth that I put in there is also that this is not the end of arms control. This is the end of an era of arms control. But in the testimony this morning, another person who was there was Tim Morrison, who had this, I think, really great line where he said, the end of New START creates a new chapter to look at all weapon systems. And so much of what PONI does is working with the next generation of nuclear leaders. And there are really creative and exciting early and mid-career folks out there who want to work on arms control. They have outside-the-box thinking. This is a moment of opportunity for them. Like, we need that. We need to inject that into this moment. But also, just very quickly, Kari, because you did ask about the Russians. Sergei Ryabkov, a senior Russian official, had a statement this morning where it was, it was leaning in pretty hard on the Trump administration to try to get them to agree to continue to observe these limits. Another thing I picked up from this, they used it as an opportunity to signal that Russia and China were in lockstep on this issue. He said explicitly, Russia respects China's position on arms control and China does the same for Moscow. Because China has said we won't participate in arms control until until the UK and France come in, essentially.
Well, and I guess where I then go with this is the chart that you showed earlier, which is data. And it's regardless of arms control, regardless of New START over the last decade or so, Russia and China have built up their nuclear forces, whether strategic forces or tactical, non-strategic forces. So it's almost as if they've neglected or sidetracked to arms control to begin with. But the question for me then becomes, you laid out a couple of different options, but each with the options that the U.S. could take. What is needed for our own national security? So those are great options, but why? Like, have we been able to explain why we should go down this path? Is it purely because we're at a deficit right now, or what is in our national security interest at this point?
I think we still don't really know the answer to this when it comes to nuclear capabilities. The closest to an answer that we have is the 2023 Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission. One of the commissioners was Rose Gottemiller, who negotiated New START. The answer they came up with was that, barring some seismic changes in the strategic landscape, that the U.S. nuclear force will have to be more and or different. And there's a lot of very clever wordsmithing that goes into that, because I think some of the commissioners would say, let's do more conventionally. Some would say, let's do more nuclear. That's the closest we have to an answer. And this brings up the National Defense Strategy as well, which I was expecting a nuclear posture review to be part of that. I was disappointed, like many others, I'm sure. The administration still hasn't really come out and said what they think the objectives are for the nuclear force and for our posture. Previous administrations have consistently said it is deterrence, it's assuring allies, it's reestablishing deterrence if it fails, and some previous administrations also said that it was hedging. But something even as basic as that, we don't have those indicators yet. So it's really hard to know which of those options is best for a wider strategy. I lean in on option 2 for more theater-based capabilities, because that's where I do see a potential gap. I've said this multiple times because it's a really important stat. At that Chinese military parade in September, they showcased 5 new intercontinental range platforms. Those were just new ones. We only have 5 total. We don't have a ton of options for flexible, agile, theater-based capabilities, whereas that is where Russia and China quite clearly have been making their investments. And so that's where I think we can lean in. I think that's also something the B-21 can potentially be useful for. But yeah, it's I completely agree with you. It would be nice to have a nuclear posture to help identify what should happen when New START expires. I'm waiting.
Well, the 3 sentences in the NDS about nuclear issues don't quite give you that. And so let me try this on for size, which is to say, you quoted Tim's comment about a new chapter and new thinking and this kind of stuff that you were suggesting is, I kind of hear from you, be not afraid. And I think that's, perhaps the silver lining here is, let's get out of the treaty. Let's realize the sky doesn't fall. And then we can start thinking. Because as long as it's here, and this goes back to INF, it was probably a good year after INF when people were still calling for, oh my goodness, we need the security blanket back.
That's right.
And it went out with a whimper. ABM went out with a whimper rather than a bang as well. And so that's what I think is going to happen here. And so I think, frankly, the benefit of no longer being under it will help encourage some of that thinking. And while I'm not, and there was some discussion this morning at the hearing about, well, we need to have a treaty about integrated air and missile defenses being restricted. Well, I don't really like that, but hey, let's talk about it.
Should we extend New START for 1 year? Some have argued for that.
No,
if you're the
I
president,
don't
do you
see
take
any.
it for-
I don't see any value in that. I think back to negotiating from a position of strength is on February 5. I would do a couple of things. I would upload some ICBMs, at least a couple, and I would put one THAAD or Patriot missile into a converted Vandenberg silo. I want to make sure and establish the principle that we are no longer under the treaty. So right after INF, what do? We launched a ground-based cruise missile, like right after, and we launched a ground-based GLIBM ballistic missile. And so I want to establish that, kind of like freedom of navigation tours. We are establishing the fact that we are no longer under this. So I would put one missile defense interceptor in a converted silo, and I would upload some things, and then figure out where you want to go from there.
I mean, this is kind of controversial on something like New START. I don't think it matters that much whether or not we agree to observe it for another year. Either way, I would recommend that the U.S. prepare to upload. Maybe don't start uploading, especially if you agree to abide by the limits, but you can prepare to upload. A lot of the other options that I laid out, some of those aren't things that are going to happen, and like getting more B-21s is not going to happen in the next year. You can plan to do those things. And so to some extent, I just really don't see what the huge benefit is, aside from the symbolism of a continuity of arms control. And perhaps the hope that maybe in the next year there will be some opportunity for a breakthrough. For example, can you tie arms control somehow into the end of the war in Ukraine? I believe the president's already tried that. I don't think it really worked out. But that's kind of the only real benefit, is that symbolism, because all the concerns about the arms race is, if it's an arms race, Russia and China have already started. I don't think we are in an arms race just because of academic reasons for how we define arms racing, to be honest. But the moment for strategic competition has come, and 1 year without a treaty, without inspections, but abiding by these limits, I'll be honest, I'm struggling to get what the big deal is in some ways.
Yeah.
But the other thing, I just remembered this. In the New START ratification and consent in 2010, there is a line in there that requires the next arms control agreement to address tactical nuclear weapons.
All weapons.
So this is not coming out of nowhere. This was tied to New START. This is a problem with the Russians that we have known about for a really long time and just kept kicking the can down the road. And so I think it's time to just be not afraid, address the issue. Let's try something creative, and say what you will about this president's nuclear policy and issues. He has an appetite and an interest in a real arms control agreement, and this might be a time to try something new.
Okay, I was just going to say, for me, is my skepticism comes out in that I don't know what it changes if we do extend it. It's, to your point, we're not getting access. There's no ability for us to verify or inspect, so there's no mechanism there. And then I go back to fundamentally, what would it curb? When you look at data like you have here, it's not curbing them or the Chinese, particularly the Chinese, pursuit of these new, modern, longer range systems. It's not curbing the tactical systems. It's not curbing dual use or dual capable systems that both of them have gone throttled forward on. So what does it do? What does it change?
Just one other quick data point on the harm that I think it might do comes from the allies. Because I've been having a lot of conversations with allies over the past few months about how they're trying to understand the new administration and the new administration's policy. And I asked some of them, what would worry you most from this administration? And they said arms control. Now, I think a 1-year extension of New START isn't going to be something that sends allies towards breaking out of the NPT. That's not what I mean to say. But allies, some of whom have a lot of domestic pressure that is anti-nuclear and that wants arms control, I'm hearing them saying, now might not be the moment for this. And so, I would be worried that they might interpret the president accepting Putin's offer as being conciliatory towards Putin at a time when European allies in particular, that's the last thing that they want to see.
Yeah. The other thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention is, independent of arms control, there is a nuclear enterprise right now in our country that is aging. There was the grand bargain, Tom, that you mentioned back in the 2010, 2011 timeframe, which, I go back to that time when we were on the Hill and we took members of Congress out to the entire weapons complex, to missile bases, to talk to our allies and partners, and we even went out and talked to the Russians as well. There would not have been a New START deal in Congress, in the Senate, had you not also had the nuclear modernization commitment that the Obama administration made. But 15 years later, we're still not there. Mm-hmm. So I also just don't want to neglect in this conversation things like stockpile stewardship, so enhancing the modeling and simulation, the data, the compute, the science, the weapon life extension programs, the warhead modernization programs, the delivery systems, the nuclear command and control modernization, the complex itself. I mean, the number of buildings that we went to, Y-12, Los Alamos, that we're still operating in World War II facilities blew my mind. So if we're, as we modernize, and if there's any hope of curbs in the future, you need to have a modern, flexible, adaptable complex, anchored in the right kind of science, technology, engineering. But that's a piece that we're still implementing that plan from 15 years ago, and we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. The last maybe topic we'll hit on, and then we'll do a question here, is it is the future of arms control. Why arms control, and where do we go from here? What would you curb, and I guess open-ended question. Heather, where does it go from here?
So there's where I would like it to go.
Yeah.
Where it is going to go, and then somewhere in the middle is what we might work towards. Where I would like it to go is those non-strategic nuclear systems. An idea that has been floated by many others, not just me, is to have a ceiling. So it's not just about your strategic, operationally deployed strategic systems, but to also include those non-strategic systems in there, and then allow for that flexibility of the force structure that they had under New START, but just expanding that. That's one idea. However, it would have to be trilateral. And so this gets to what is probably most likely to happen, which is the U.S. will probably keep insisting that China come to the table, and China will just keep saying no. And I interpreted Ryabkov's statement as saying that the Russians will stick with the Chinese on this one, and the Russians will be happy to come to the arms control table without the Chinese there, making us look like the bad guy. But that's one option for an arms control agreement that I would really like to see us move forward. With that said, you both have raised a really important point, which I'm not sure how we get past. How do we ever trust the Russians again? Based on their legacy of non-compliance, duplicity, trying to use arms control and other nuclear multilateral fora against us, how do we bake that into some sort of an arms control agreement to mitigate that risk? And I'll be honest, I don't have an answer to that one. But just very quickly, the middle ground option of what I think might actually be achievable and could provide some real benefit. You want arms control to reduce the risk that nuclear weapons are ever used at the most basic level. You want transparency and predictability. The middle ground option that I think is worth considering and pursuing is a head of state level summit, an agreement on reducing the risk of nuclear weapons. So Putin, Xi, and Trump sitting down and saying, here are some really basic things that we can agree to. Things like keeping a human in the loop, which the Russians have historically said no to. Setting up nuclear hotlines, which the Chinese have historically said no to. But elevating it to the head of state level, and this is something he's not bad at this, right? And he likes it. He likes the visibility. Yeah. That is something that feels a little bit more achievable to me, and also genuinely could produce some results in terms of concrete ideas for risk reduction without making ourselves vulnerable to the inevitable Russian noncompliance.
Yeah, I would just caution that over the past year, there's been a lot of head of state pronouncements that such and such a country will invest $100 billion in the United States, or this and the other thing as part of kind of trade and tariff deals. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword that you might get that statement in a non-binding, non-treaty thing, which is perhaps for the better, and we might be lulled into thinking that that's meaningful without it actually getting anything concrete, to your point.
I actually agree with that. I also somewhat support this idea because of the wider nuclear politics. This is a year for the NPT review conference, which only happens once every 5 years. the NPT is fragile. I'm really worried about the NPT, and I still want to save it. And I want the US in particular to have something to bring to the NPT. Because, as I said, Russia and China get a free pass, particularly in the NPT. They are not called out for these buildups and these numbers. Russia is not called out for noncompliance. A lot of the blame always falls on the US, but also the UK. I mean, one of the smallest arsenals, and the poor Brits get blamed. So I would like us to bring something to the NPT to show that we as a country still believe in arms control and we still believe in nuclear risk reduction. But I agree to the extent that we could expect, if we set up a hotline with the Chinese, will anyone pick up the phone? I would want a plan B.
So you're hitting on a question from the audience here. How will the expiration of New START affect the upcoming NPT conference? This is the Nuclear Nonproliferation Conference.
I put it on a growing list of things that are going to make RevCon, the review conference, extremely challenging. The other things that I put on there I actually think nuclear testing and language on nuclear testing is possibly going to be the biggest challenge for the NPT review conference. And something I often point to when people raise this, they're like, oh, well, surely the administration will agree to language on a testing moratorium. And I'll say, I don't know the answer to that, but I didn't hear you asking the Russians and the Chinese about their violations, their potential violations of the testing moratorium over the past 8 years. And so I do keep coming back to this point of accountability where if we wanted a successful RevCon, well, then Russia and China should have been being held accountable a long time ago. And this gets, there's a lot of deep NPT politics and wonkdom there that I'll spare people. But I give the RevCon a 50-50 shot of coming up with a consensus document, which is often pointed to as the metric of success. I don't think that's the right metric, but whatever. And so I give it a 50-50 chance. I don't think that the end of New START is going to be the thing that breaks NPT RevCon. I'm more worried about things like testing, push for a WMD-free zone in the Middle East, language about past commitments. But I really hope that states will take this moment and the end of arms control as a moment to look back on, how did we get here? Well, going back to these charts, this is how we got here. Russia's violation of all these past agreements. So this isn't just a moment to, put up the latest thing that Trump has said about nuclear testing, or to blame it on U.S. withdrawal from ABM or INF. Don't get me wrong, that is part of the story, but there is another whole part of this story that has not been told. And so I hope that this is the moment that we can have that conversation.
U.S. officials have not done a great job of telling that story. And so, to some extent, I think, and I should say this is a bipartisan thing, which is that we haven't countered the moral argument, right, that we're the bad guys and that kind of thing. I don't think we've countered it sufficiently.
I agree.
Okay, testing. Let me throw out another question from our audience here. Without testing, or particularly underground nuclear testing, there is no way to know the true reliability of our weapons in the stockpile. And so this person says, I firmly believe we should be starting underground nuclear testing once again, especially since Russia and China are going up to the criticality point, and some may even assess that they actually are testing beyond criticality. So what's your take on testing?
Look, the directors of the national labs have repeatedly said that the arsenal is safe, secure, and reliable without a return to underground testing. I'm going to trust their judgment on that. With that said, the president's post about returning to testing, I do think is stirring up this conversation for understandable reasons again. And Sig Hecker had a really great piece in Foreign Affairs breaking this down. Obviously, Sig is kind of a real living legend in the nuclear field, works at Los Alamos, did some of the inspections in North Korea, where he really broke down the pros and the cons of testing. And so I can see, in some ways, I can kind of see both ways. On the technical side, I am fully going to defer to the labbies. I am not going to say that I understand the potential benefits of getting to, critical nuclear testing. But with that said, the testing moratorium non-testing is one of the few sacred norms in the nuclear field that we still have left. I would rather we continue to uphold them. However, if Russia and China are achieving some sort of strategic advantage by violating that testing moratorium, then I think the next step is to try and sit down with the Russians and the Chinese and say, can we come to some sort of agreement on maybe it's a new version of the threshold test ban treaty? Maybe it, the previous administration actually suggested reciprocal on-site inspections, which I thought was a great idea. Obviously, the Russians, the Chinese didn't go for this, but I think the next step is to try to reestablish some sort of reliability and some transparency into each other's testing activities. If we do go that direction, I would really rather that Russia and China just abide by the testing moratorium and we don't return to testing.
It's been over a quarter century since the Senate voted down CTBT. And to your point, there's different interpretations, that kind of thing. I guess the question is, do we need to revisit that and try to refine it and define it a little more precisely? And so that may be withdrawing signature from CTBT so that we're no longer bound by the object and purpose of the treaty, and we can actually define it in some other way.
I would just make two observations. One, for policymakers, it is a fact that a former DIA director, when he was in the position, publicly came out and said, we assess that both Russia and China have tested beyond subcritical levels. So we know, at least according to our intelligence community, that has happened, and that should factor into our policy perspective. But then, Heather, to your point, let's rely on the lab folks. Technically and operationally, the reason that we have been able to not have to return to testing to date is because of the Stockpile Stewardship Program
right.
and the tremendous science and modeling that the labs do. That Stockpile Stewardship Program is over 20 years old, monitoring and assessing weapons on a regular basis that are 40 to 50 years old. So I do worry, this goes back to the whole modernization and investment discussion. Unless we're willing to put in the investment to ensure that we can continue to do that into perpetuity, which sometimes I question, are we truly committed to that? We will reach a breaking point with respect to the safety and reliability of our nuclear stockpile. And then you're now presenting policymakers that decision of we may have to return to testing in order to assure that the credibility and the performance of those weapons.
I've always been in terms of an if-then statement. If it becomes necessary, then we shouldn't be afraid of it. We don't necessarily need to rush into it. But if stockpile stewardship is insufficient, then we got to think about it differently.
I would also just add from a bipartisan, I would think that support of the labs could get bipartisan consensus for the stockpile stewardship, but also for preparing for testing if it ever becomes necessary, but also for arms control. The technological research that goes into arms control verification, on-site inspections, the equipment that you use, that's all developed by the labs. The people who do that, they come from the national labs. And I've been really lucky to go and visit a lot of them and see some of the work that they're doing, like on using AI potentially for arms control verification. It's really cool cutting edge research. And so the labs aren't just the place for the warheads and for the deterrence side of the community. It is also the investment that needs to be made if you do want a future in arms control. And so the big picture story there is the enterprise needs more investment, but it also does need a bit of a focus here. And so I keep coming back to that this is a moment for opportunity to think about not just what happens, on February 5th. Is it upload? Is it a nuclear posture review that tells us what additional capabilities we need? It is also a moment to try to think more creatively and revive arms control.
So we've gone a little bit long here, but Tom, I want your take on the future of arms control. Heather laid out her vision. Yeah, the Russians, the Chinese, they've put missile defense on the table. They've put space on the table. What do you think the future of arms control is?
Yeah, I think, as I've said kind of before, that we're going to enter you call it a new era. I would say we're going to enter a wilderness, and we have to figure out what it is that we want to cut up or put a fence around. I've said it before, I don't think we know what those things are. We've discussed this in the past. I don't think we're clear in our own mind about what a strategic weapon is, right? And so it's the S in all of these START agreements. Like, what is that? And again, that's why this chart is so important, is what's a strategic weapon and what's a non-strategic weapon. I don't think we figured that out. And there's plenty of folks, frankly, the euphemism for this 5 years ago was emerging technologies and nuclear deterrence, right? And then everybody had their pet rock of cyber this and AI that and what have you. But I don't think we know. And that's why I think that we shouldn't be afraid of perhaps a little bit of upload here and there. But I would also say, when we start having those conversations where we're unencumbered by some of this intellectual baggage, I think that'll be a good thing. We need to have other conversations about different types of delivery systems, and you call them tactical systems. So maybe it's more B-21s, but we've had a policy over multiple administrations now that we are not going to mix and match our nuclear things with our hypersonic glidey things. Like, those are the questions that have to be asked. There's other domains from which things that glow in the dark might come from. We've seen Russia pursue a nuclear thing in orbit, going back to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. So I think, again, we have not appreciated the degree to which the tectonic plates have moved dramatically, and that the vocabulary, the meaning of the word strategic that was set back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, I think we need to let it lapse, let it expire, and let's truly take a fresh look at the world. And I think it might look very different from what these documents kind of presupposed.
Well, Kari, how would you answer that question?
So here's the thing. I don't have religion when it comes to arms control. I'd like to consider myself more of a realist or pragmatist when it comes to it. It is a tool, it is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. And sometimes I worry folks think of it as an end. So for me, it's the question of what are we trying to curb? And when I look at a chart like this, there are plenty of things I'd love to curb in Russia and China's nuclear arsenals. Everything from some of these new strategic weapon systems that they unveiled at the parade, to the non-strategic weapons, to things like this Chinese fractional orbital bombardment system, so a weapon that orbits Earth and then re-enters Earth and strikes a target on land. So there are things I'd like to curb. But then when I look at, well, hold on, what do we have to put on the table?
That's right.
We don't have much to put on the table that doesn't really affect our security. And oh, by the way, we're at a deficit right now. So giving ourselves, well, one, investing in the capabilities that we truly need, but also giving ourselves some optionality so that if we do at some point think that the conditions are ripe for some kind of curbing agreement, because it really is curbing capability or curbing action, then at least we have something to go to the table with. And you've mentioned this already, we're at such a trust and transparency deficit right now. I mean, the conditions are not even ripe to have those kind of, I just don't think that the conditions are ripe to have those kind of serious discussions. So rebuilding that trust, I think, starts with, we're back in the toddler phase here, some basic discussions, basic areas of how can we reduce miscalculation, reduce risk, notifications, track 2s, track 1.5s. I mean, I think we're back to that basic level.
Especially with the Chinese,
we never had it with the Chinese.
I mean, the Chinese have only recently started doing missile launch notifications even, and had one meeting with the Biden administration on it. But you think about all of that legacy that we have with the Russians for this sort of dialogue. We're barely beginning with the Chinese. And so in that sense, how do we navigate trying to have both of those conversations? And so I'll come back to what I think is potentially the way ahead. It does have to start at the top. It doesn't just start at the top. I also think the track 2s, perhaps some next generation engagement is always something that I'll push. But it's the trust deficit on both sides is going to be really challenging.
Can I just put a red line under what some of you said, which is I was being coy and didn't pull out. I said, these things can come from multiple domains. Well, you said it, Kari. You said it's FOBs, and so that was what I was talking about, which is different kinds of things in, from, and through space. And the phrase FOBs or MOBs goes back to the 70s when the Soviets were doing a fractional orbital bombardment, multiple orbital bombardment. The phrase doesn't even work for what we're talking about today, because it's not really bombardment whenever you have something that is a aerodynamic glide vehicle coming in. It's not a bombardment. And it could be multiple, could be all these other kinds of things. But I think that the richness, this is maybe we should have a session on space fires, for instance. But this is frankly one of the 17 reasons why getting some A2AD for ourselves, also known as Golden Dome, to hedge against the multiple kinds of delivery systems that are not strategic and listed as strategic in some treaty, is kind of a good idea, right? This is why the Golden Dome Initiative is kind of a good idea. Hopefully we can start putting some things on contract here quick. But among other things, the space fires, and yes, nuclear things in space is something I think we're probably going to hear more of.
Okay, so let's end this, although we could keep going on for another hour or two. We like to close with somewhat of a sporty question, so how about we do this? What's your hot take on the National Defense Strategy? We haven't talked about that. It came out since our last HTK episode.
I mean, my bumper sticker on it is, where's the rest? Particularly on nuclear, I just wanted more. I was appreciative of the language saying, I think it was something like, we commit to the modernization program. Beyond that, it really left me with more questions than anything. What is our nuclear declaratory policy? Are we still maintaining the current status of extended nuclear deterrence to our allies and partners? I'm not really sure. Is there a vision for arms control, the NPT, to somehow implement the president's vision for denuclearization? And you said this about Golden Dome. I think a lot of it applies to nuclear weapons as well, which is you get the vision, you get the top level statement, the details are lacking, and the details really matter. So for me, the NDS left me wondering, where's the rest, and tell me more.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it matters that much. The 3 sentences, the nuclear posture paragraph that we got in the NDS, didn't have that kind of wonk, carefully wrought tone. The whole thing kind of felt a little more like a speech. I was just sitting here and I was looking at that paragraph, and it says the United States requires a strong, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. Remember how that phrase has changed over the years?
Yeah.
First it was safe, secure, and reliable.
Safe, secure, reliable,
And
safe,
then
secure.
it was safe, secure, and
effective.
effective. Now it's strong, secure, and effective. And it's just, I don't know, it sounds tougher or something like that. Look, I would have been, novelty is not always necessary. I would have probably been mostly happy with copying and pasting from the last Trump NPR on declaratory policy and so forth. So look, maybe it'll go forward, but frankly, I don't have the yearning for a policy document or posture document as much as I have a yearning for budgets and buying stuff.
Good. What about you, Kari?
It didn't surprise me. It stuck pretty close to the national security strategy, which we'd expect, and frankly, all of the various executive orders and telegraphing that the administration has done. So I guess, if you set aside some of the political rhetoric and language in the document, it outlines this administration's priorities, which we pretty much knew what they were already. It was going to be Homeland Defense, Western Hemisphere, strong industrial base. I would have liked to have seen it be stronger on China. And then, Tom, to your point, a strategy is only as good as its implementation, and you implement it through actions, programs, and budgets. And that'll be the true test of whether this thing sticks or not. So, all right, with that in mind, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. This was a really great discussion. I enjoyed it. Thanks to our teams in Pony, Missile Defense Project, and Aerospace Security Project, and to our streaming and broadcasting team for making this event possible. Keep your radars tuned in to this frequency so that you don't miss future HTK discussions on strategic forces.